In 1941, the biggest invasion force in human history crossed over the Soviet border and began their long, long march to Moscow. But why would the Germans do such a thing whilst already at war with the British Empire? According to the historical narrative, it tends to go as follows. Hitler, as he stated in Mein Kampf, had always planned to implement his infamous Lebensraum idea by invading and colonizing the Soviet Union. Some will take this a step further and say that he planned to exterminate or enslave the current inhabitants. Now, with continental Europe either under his control, allied to him, or neutral, it was time for Hitler to complete his conquest of Europe. Stalin, on the other hand, was sitting with his feet up and was taken totally by surprise by the German invasion.
The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury.
But is this really what happened? The Germans certainly didn't think so. Even common sense wouldn't suggest so. To put the mainstream narrative into perspective, this is what it sounds like in blunt terms. Adolf Hitler, while still at war with the British Empire and all her vast resources across the globe, chose to invade the Soviet Union, the biggest country on Earth with the largest army on Earth, purely for reasons of conquest and colonization. The East would always require more men, equipment, and vehicles than the West, so in doing so, he was choosing to divert the majority of his means of making war away from the war with Britain. This makes no sense. It is simply historical revision to fit the good guys, bad guys Hollywood narrative. It's simple and therefore easy to listen to, absorb, and then believe. In the mainstream narrative, the Soviet Union is portrayed as evil beyond description between the years 1917 and 1941, especially when they invaded the Baltic states and Poland, or inflicted the Holodomor upon the Ukrainians. Then, from 1941 to 1945, they are the saviors of the world at best, and at worst, the lesser of two evils, who valiantly stopped Adolf Hitler's evil Nazi Germany. Then, after the war's end, the Soviets are suddenly the evil bad guys again. The Cold War begins, and the Americans begin their global struggle of good and evil, freedom and slavery, right and wrong against the Soviets. The Cold War, which in a way never ended. Russia is still painted as the Soviet Union today. The truth is, this entire narrative is out of whack. The Soviet Union that Churchill tried to rally the world to go to war with in 1917 was not only as barbaric, but more barbaric in 1939 when the Brits tried to make an anti-German alliance with them. As we know, this backfired, however, and Hitler was forced to make a better offer in order to not be encircled, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was born. Hitler apparently felt sick to his stomach at having to give up the Baltic states to Soviet brutality. But at the cost of keeping Germany safe, it was a necessary evil in his eyes. From here, many would call the Soviets and the Germans allies, but they were no such thing. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was just that, a pact, an agreement, not an alliance. After Poland had been divided up, albeit with difficulty, as Stalin stalled until the last minute to invade, there was nothing left to agree upon. I've covered the events leading up to the outbreak of war between the Soviets and Germany in detail in this video, which I'll display on the screen now. But to summarize a few, Stalin delayed giving back German POWs that he collected from the east of Poland. The Soviets were behind and immediately recognized the Yugoslavian coup, which led to the war in that country. The Soviets invaded Romania and took over Bessarabia, even before the ultimatum expired. Stalin tried to bribe Bulgaria into carving up Turkey with him so that the Soviets could control the Dardanelles. Finland's elections were being meddled with and demands were being made. A new winter war was potentially on the horizon. As a result of all this, all of Eastern Europe was throwing themselves into the arms of Hitler, begging for alliances, guarantees, and protection from the increasingly bold Soviets. And finally, and most importantly, on the eastern border of Germany, there was an absolutely gigantic buildup of troops, armour, and aircraft. In fact, the biggest in history. Recon flights returned home with terrifying tales of tank parks loaded to the brim and airfields overflowing with planes. Construction was underway absolutely everywhere. The most worrying thing of all, however, was that none of the construction projects were defensive. These were not anti-tank ditches and bunkers. These were offensive projects. Railway tracks were laid everywhere, leading to the front, not with the Russian railway gauge, but with the European one. Barracks were being constructed, which were all full of troops. All along the border was a sea of activity. In total, the conservative estimate is that there was dozens of divisions, and tanks numbering in the low tens of thousands. Eventually, Hitler could take no more and called the Soviet bluff. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov was invited to Berlin to sign the Tripartite Pact, whilst Hitler knew full well that the Soviets would never do such a thing. To no one's surprise, instead of signing, Molotov dished out a list of demands. 1. No German troops in Finland. 2. Soviet military occupation of Turkey. 3. Recognition of the Persian Gulf as a Soviet sphere of influence. 4. Japan must renounce its claims on Soviet territory. 5. Bulgaria must become a Soviet-controlled state in order to protect Soviet control of the Black Sea and the Dardanelles. The Soviets had been tricked into revealing their hand, and now Hitler could proceed with clarity. He had only one logical choice. With the British booted out of continental Europe, he had a limited amount of time now to attack the Soviets before they attacked Europe. Time was quite literally of the essence. In 1939, the Soviet army had 1.9 million men in its ranks. In 1941, it now had 5 million. If this build-up was allowed to continue, and the offensive preparations were allowed to continue all over the border, then Germany would never stand a chance, simply in terms of population and resources. Even now, it was perhaps too late, but Germany had to try. Does this situation sound like an unprovoked attack in order to acquire Lebensraum? Besides all the evidence, another point that matters is what the Germans themselves believe they were fighting for. Let's hear what they had to say. Firstly, let's hear from a man who would be most in the know, Heinrich Himmler, de facto second most powerful man in the Reich. Here are a selection of quotes of his on the topic. The first two are quotes from 1943. Quote, in 1941, the Führer attacked Russia. That was, as we can probably ascertain today, a short time, perhaps a quarter to half a year before Stalin made his great incursion into Central and Western Europe, end quote. The second quote goes, quote, it was a difficult decision for us to start the war with Russia, whilst we were still at war with England and had to occupy large parts of Europe. Every month has shown how right the Führer's decision was. If we had not attacked, the Russians, with their concentration of 20,000 tanks, would have launched a thrust against us. We must openly admit that no army in the world could have withstood this thrust. Like Attila, the Russians would have marched through the whole of Europe, end quote. And finally, earlier in 1942, he said, quote, the war with Russia was the most necessary war there has ever been. I believe that no one is more called upon to recognize this than you, who have stood at the focal point of this struggle. For us, and especially for the whole German people, it is certain that if the Führer had not decided last year to attack Russia, then only a few months would have passed, and Russia would have attacked us. Whether Russia would have done this in a more or less harmless way by invading Romania in the fall of 1941, destroying the fuel plants so important to Germany, which in turn would have made it impossible for us to attack Russia itself in Romania, and which would also have prevented us from stopping an attack on the German border. Russia, if it had continued with this plan, would probably have invaded Finland, and then, in 1942, would have descended upon a Europe which would have been only able to supply the Luftwaffe with its small domestic supplies of petroleum and gasoline artificially produced from lignite, end quote. As we can see, it's clear Himmler, the second most important man in the state, believed that Germany was fighting a preemptive war to stop the Soviet Union conquering Europe. There are hundreds more quotes along these same lines. Hitler, Himmler, and all the rest of them always talked of Europe as a whole, as opposed to just Germany or the German people, although obviously that was their first priority. To these men, Germany was the only nation who truly understood the gravity of the situation, given that they themselves had been through communist revolutions and barely come out on top. If the Soviets were to fall upon Europe, it would be, and eventually was in reality, a bloodbath. Now let's hear from Otto Ernst Riemer, the man mostly responsible for stopping the July 20th coup against Hitler. Riemer, whilst always remaining anti-communist, did work with the KGB, and his party in West Germany was even partly funded by the Soviets, so it's safe to say this wasn't the most biased source ever. He was asked the following in a 1990 interview: did you agree with Hitler's policies, particularly his policy towards Russia? And he replied, quote, regarding the military campaign against the Soviet Union. First of all, it should be clearly understood that at the time of the Balkans campaign in Yugoslavia and Greece in early 1941, when we had 10 divisions on the entire length of the Soviet border, the Russians had stationed 247 major military formations on our border. After the conclusion of the Balkans campaign, we then quickly placed at most 170 major military units on the border with the Soviet Union. The Russians had readied themselves for an attack. The initial successes of our forces against the Soviets were due to the fact that the Russians were not stationed in defensive positions, but were instead positioned right at the front for attack, which made it possible for us to quickly encircle large Soviet forces. Thus, in the first few weeks of the war, we were able to capture more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, as well as enormous quantities of war equipment, all of which was on the frontier, positioned for attack. That's the truth of the matter, which can be proven. I recently spoke with a Mr. Pemsel, who was a long-range aerial reconnaissance pilot. In the period before the beginning of the Soviet campaign, he flew as far as the Don River and observed and reported on this enormous concentration of Soviet forces on the border, end quote. He was then asked a follow-up question. Do you believe war with the Soviet Union was inevitable following Hitler and Molotov's meeting in November 1940? He answered, quote, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov demanded the Dardanelles. That is, we were supposed to approve the turning over of foreign territory which belonged to the Turks. Molotov thus made provocative demands which simply could not be met. Hitler was also conscious of the Soviet takeover of territory in Romania at a time of supposed peace. Hitler also knew that the anti-German uprising in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, was organized by the Soviets. It was the Russians who wrecked the relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union. And after he received more and more reports of Soviet preparations for an attack against Germany and Europe, Hitler reacted. I am thus absolutely certain that Hitler did not originally plan to attack the Soviet Union. Instead, he acted as the changing situation demanded. I also know from my own experience in the Russian campaign and with the Russian prisoners about the preparations by the Soviets for an imminent attack against Europe. The Russians were hoping that we would move against Britain so that they could take advantage of the situation to overrun Europe, end quote. As we can see, what the Germans thought they were fighting for is clear. Whether the Germans would have colonized areas of the East is neither here nor there. During wars, land can be occupied and plans change. For example, Germany had absolutely no aims on Alsace-Lorraine in France before the war, even remotely. In fact, Hitler had specifically washed his hands of any Western adventures in general. In 1939, France declared war on Germany, and Germany won. Germany then reintegrated Alsace-Lorraine into the Reich. Whether this would have been the case with the Soviet Union is neither here nor there. We simply do not know. And if it was the case, we do not know to what scale. Regardless, the important point here that we know for certain is that the war against the Soviet Union was started for the reasons stated above. Whether you believe that was the right action, or if the Soviets would have ever attacked, is up to you. Again, we'll never know. What matters is that Hitler and the leading National Socialists, perhaps understandably, believed with 100% conviction that the Soviet actions were leading up to an invasion of Germany, and by extension, Europe. Lebensraum never even comes into the conversation. There were some in the NSDAP who would have had theories on what to do if such an occasion ever arose in the East, but Hitler certainly wasn't one of these people. He had far bigger issues at the time to worry about. He was thinking purely from a military point of view. Britain was not going to surrender, and whilst they had the continent to themselves, and there was a chance, however small, to beat the Soviets before they grew too strong, he had to invade. Thank you very much for watching. Before you go, what's your thoughts on the matter? I'd love to hear down below why you believe the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. But anyway, if you do enjoy these videos, then please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps a lot. And as always, the biggest thanks of all goes to my Patreon, Subscribe Star, and YouTube subscribers.